In my last set of videos, I addressed some of the problems surrounding involuntary psychiatric commitment. Namely, I discussed how 1. The mental health industry plays on the myth that the supposedly mentally ill are dangerous when justifying involuntary psychiatric commitment. 2. Involuntary psychiatric commitment, when accompanied by perceptions of coercion, is associated with an increased risk of suicide after discharge. 3. General psychiatric hospitalization, not necessarily involuntary psychiatric commitment specifically, may also increase the risk of suicide after discharge, such that someone who is hospitalized without even suicidal ideation may leave the hospital wanting to take their own life. And 4. Even an increased amount of psychiatric follow-up after discharge is associated with an increased risk of suicide. To focus on the topic of stigma, the mental health industry and its allies, if you will, continually harp on the idea of reducing the stigma against mental illness. Take this from the CDC. Mental health stigma. Reducing stigma may look like policies and practices that support people with a mental health condition, reducing barriers they face in settings like workplaces and healthcare. Policies and practices like what? Policies such as the same damaging involuntary psychiatric commitment I have already noted, with its coerced diagnosis and treatment. Journalists, communicators, and others in the media working to educate the public responsibly about mental health. So the medical model of mental illnesses can be continually pushed despite the lack of existence, as I have already reiterated elsewhere, of any biological markers or tests available for said illnesses. Treating those living with a mental health condition with understanding, empathy, and acceptance so that no one feels the need to hide their condition. All this is simply to get the public to embrace the conditions listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders as scientifically and medically based. That is to say, as objective reality. The bottom line, however, is that these conditions are entirely subjective and have been developed exclusively in relation to expert opinion. Look no further than Alan Francis, chair of the DSM-IV task force, and his descriptions of how the full symptomatic criteria for mental disorders were created by committee, with any disputes going in favor of the most impassioned experts. As even many within the mental health industry have argued, often with an obvious air of hypocrisy, and especially, mind you, in reaction to the publication of the DSM-5. These diagnoses often deal with normal human suffering. In other words, these conditions are in fact not pathological or mental disease. They are often simple responses to the inherent cruelties and difficulties of life. But of course, at this juncture, you get the whole social movement and terminology of neurodivergence. But the problem with the whole movement is that all it tries to do, in the end, is remove the disease connotation while still embracing the medical nature of these conditions. However, there is no justification for considering these labels as anything other than subjective. Again, they have no basis in science or medicine. More than that, this is where the real stigma lies. The mental health industry has stigmatized people's normal reactions to the stresses of life. And this pulls me back to involuntary psychiatric commitment. As I have already suggested elsewhere, it seems fair to say that the public may think of such coercion as a necessary, life-saving process. It could save someone from taking their own life. The irony, however, is that it may increase the individual's desire to take their own life once they are released. Beyond someone actually trying to take their own life, suicidal ideation alone is a criterion for forced hospitalization, along with, of course, the limitless criteria that an individual might benefit from psychiatric care. This is a low bar for a procedure in which the individual is forced into the care of a set of professionals historically known to be violent, think lobotomy, and biased, despite claims to the contrary that such professionals keep their biases in check. A professional also quite likely to be controlling and manipulative. Indeed, the principal mechanism in this procedure of coercion will be to force the individual to conform to the clinician's personal and subjective view of said individual. Oh, and he or she will also have powerful drugs potentially imposed and most certainly pushed on him or her. This is why various authors writing in the academic literature on the topic have described the psychologically adverse aspects of psychiatric hospital care. Admitted patients are exposed to humiliation, stigmatization, loss of autonomy, perceived trauma, and actual violence. And again, you may think that even with suicidal ideation, humiliation, stigmatization, loss of autonomy, perceived trauma, and actual violence are necessary because such thinking must be stopped. To be very specific, however, I will again return to the Cleveland Clinic. Suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts. Suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts are thoughts or ideas centered around death or suicide. Experiencing suicidal ideation doesn't mean you're going to kill yourself, but it can be a warning sign. Treatment is available. Treatment is available or else. Nevertheless, this is an important topic given the high rate of suicide. From the CDC, over 49,000 people died by suicide in 2023. That's one death every 11 minutes. In addition, it is also important to note that the suicide rate has steadily increased since 2001. The problem is that suicidal ideation may be a normal response to difficult life circumstances, but the mental health industry has convinced Americans that these same thoughts should automatically be considered pathological. Look no further than the debate surrounding the bereavement exclusion for major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder itself is a perfect example of how the mental health industry has overstepped any basic human decency in its attempt to become the sole decision maker when it comes to what is abnormal in terms of cognition, emotion, and behavior. In brief, 5 or more of the following symptoms present during the same 2-week period constitutes the supposed mental disease. Depressed mood, markedly diminished interest or pleasure, significant weight loss or weight gain, insomnia or hypersomnia, psychomotor issues, that's nervous or intense movement or slowed movement, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, diminished ability to think, recurrent thoughts of death. There are many normal reasons why you might experience 5 or more of these symptoms, and as I highlighted, some within the mental health industry itself have spoken out about this. But even some of those same professionals talk out of both sides of their mouth, especially when it comes to the bereavement exclusion. In the DSM-3 and the DSM-4, major depressive disorder had one qualifying or contextualizing factor. Only one, mind you, outside of other mental disorders or medical conditions. It advised clinicians not to give a diagnosis if the individual in question was bereaved, but the exclusion was removed from the DSM-5. However, the bereavement exclusion itself had qualifiers. Namely, it also encouraged clinicians to give a diagnosis anyway, if the symptoms from major depressive disorder were accompanied by marked functional impairment, morbid preoccupation with worthlessness, suicidal ideation, psychotic symptoms, or psychomotor issues. Even the harshest critics of the DSM-5 still emphasized the need to give diagnoses along these lines. The bottom line is, the mental health industry has no business making these distinctions. And suicidal ideation is an arbitrary line upon which to make any distinction, especially without looking at any of the context of a person's life. And if an individual is struggling to find a reason to live, that individual should have a place to turn to discuss that fact. The individual does need to be responsible about whom he or she shares such information with, but at the same time, that person should not have to fear literal incarceration, abuse, humiliation, and violence for sharing the mere fact that he or she is struggling to find meaning and purpose in life. The fact that such a person has every reason not to trust someone with such information, even potentially their closest loved ones or family, without fear of potential retribution because of how the culture has bought into these arbitrary distinctions from the mental health industry regarding health and illness, even to the point of allowing mass incarceration, speaks loudly about how much our society cares for personal freedom and autonomy, and how we treat the people in our lives we should care for. instead of pushing the idea that people must accept such reactions to the inevitable harsh realities of life as pathological conditions for which they must submit themselves to the care of psychiatrists and therapists, or else the actual subject of the whole popularized mental illness stigma conversation. Perhaps instead of that, we should normalize having those difficult emotional conversations with our friends, family members, and loved ones. Maybe we should normalize giving a damn about the people we should be caring for. And I will leave it off here until next time. I hope to see you there.